Hello, I'm Robert Ellsberg. I'm the publisher of Orbis Books. Very glad to be joined today by Diarmuid O'Murchu, an Irish priest, social psychologist, and visionary thinker, who happens to be also one of our most prolific authors. His latest book is Ecological Spirituality, and it's his, I think, 15th book with Orbis. Some of his previous titles include In the Beginning Was the Spirit, Evolutionary Faith Beyond Original Sin, and Doing Theology in an Evolutionary Way. Drawing on science, cosmology, anthropology, paleontology, many other fields, these books have vastly expanded our view of the world and its place in an evolving universe. He has helped breathe new life into old doctrines while opening the way to a more adult appropriation of Christian faith. He is interested not just in finding meaning and credibility in the Christian message, but in laying the framework for a renewed faith and consciousness relevant to the challenge of human survival on the planet. And that's the particular focus of his new book, Ecological Spirituality. So welcome, Diarmuid. You begin by noting the unmistakable signs of ecological crisis today. And in some ways, your book is a response to this crisis, but you're really calling for the recovery of intuitions and insights that long predate this current crisis. Is that right?
That would be correct. Thank you for having me on, and thanks for publishing the book once again. It's been a joy working with you and with Orbis. Yes, one key point, I suppose, in the book, and this is not new, other authors have been addressing the same thing. The dualistic split between the sacred and the secular still prevails, unfortunately, in many of the great world religions and across several Christian denominations. And so will this crisis help us to build a bridge so that we begin to see and address the sacredness in everything, and then begin to become more proactive in engaging with some of the dangerous trends that are now emerging, and the threat they pose not merely to human life, but indeed to all forms of life on our planet.
So when you talk about a kind of a deeper spiritual crisis that underlies the ecological crisis, that would be, to begin with, this kind of dualism or
yes,
that we have between our identity as members of the world or earth creatures,
yes,
and creation.
That would be correct, yes. And it creates, again, several commentators have been saying this for a number of years now, and it creates a kind of a dismissive attitude towards the creation at large. It kind of sees us humans as superior, taking literally the idea from the book of Genesis that we're masters of creation, which I think every good Hebrew scholar would say should be nuanced, to hear it more in terms of stewardship and care, rather than mastery in that very kind of hierarchical, patriarchal sense. And therefore, picking up the language maybe of somebody like Thomas Berry, how do we begin to develop a relationship with the earth and with creation, which is about subject to subject rather than subject to object?
Well, I suppose that dualism or sense of detachment from the world is also an aspect of modernity, of modern secular consciousness, but in terms of Christian spirituality has so often and traditionally been focused on the spiritual realm as somehow above or as opposed to the kind of material earthiness of our environment and our existence.
That would be correct. And therefore, a key point for me in the book, it's on page 46, that wonderful quotation from Laudato Si, number 139. Nature cannot be regarded as something separate from ourselves or as a mere setting in which we live. We are part of nature, included in it, and thus in constant interaction with it. That's an incredibly revolutionary statement. As far as I know, it's the first papal document ever to make that statement, because the whole history of Christianity has been about preparing ourselves to enter more into the realm of the supernatural. Whereas that document And that quotation is saying, it would seem that our primary God-given identity is to be earthlings, creatures of our earth, who feel more at home on the earth and learn to work with it as subject to subject. And therefore, the big revolution then in which of that is the need to rethink this emphasis we have put on the soul, which of course we got largely from Plato and Aristotle, that we're creatures with a soul and that nothing else has the soul, and that entitles us to be superior to everything else in creation. Now, here we need to draw the distinction between being unique and being superior. We are unique, but so is every other creature. I think according to that thinking, there are no superior beings in God's creation. And that seems to be God's desire for creation, that it's more of an even playing field in which we learn to live with a new mutuality with and for each other.
So Pope Francis is really an ally for you now in this, perhaps, huh?
Yeah, certainly in that vision. I sometimes wonder, does Pope Francis himself realize the sheer revolutionary impact of what he's saying, particularly in that specific quotation? Mm-hmm. Because it changes the whole face of Christian theology and of Christian thinking, it seems to me.
You don't write about it very much in this book, I think, but noting that you are from Ireland, is there not some kind of echo of kind of Celtic spirituality, maybe in this appreciation for creation and the earth? Or
yes, there is. Now I don't talk too much about that, as some other scholars maybe pick it up. I think at times there is a danger. I suppose I'm more naturally attracted to the sciences, and that's where I tend to put my emphasis. I also have some difficulty, even as an Irish person. A number of my own fellow Irish men and women, I think we over-glamorize the Celtic bit. The bits that are important are our love for the earth and our close affiliation with creation. But what people often forget, this whole penitential approach to Christianity, yes, which has caused so much guilt among people and shame and all the rest of it. It was actually the Irish monks that pioneered that going across Europe. And I'm not entirely clear where they got it from. But, when we talk about Celtic spirituality, right, we have to be aware that there is that, I call it shadow side.
Yeah, the shadow side, you might say. Yeah, right. Yes. We once did a book, actually, that kind of contrasted what they call the Irish Church versus Celtic spirituality, and they're not the same. Right. You have kind of a very unique kind of definition of what spirituality is. You say it's spirit connecting with spirit, or the spirit connecting with. Could you explain a little bit what that means?
Well, firstly, I want to thank you, Robert, and thank Orbis for publishing that book of mine. In the beginning was the Spirit, which in many ways I consider one of my top unique kind of books, and sadly is the one that hasn't been picked up much as yet by other theologians, because I'm deeply inspired by Indigenous peoples around the world. Mm-hmm. My first acquaintance with them was with the Aborigines in Australia, the Maori in New Zealand, and then various groups across the United States and Canada. And their understanding of God, and interestingly, they have this name across several cultures, even among groups that have never actually met or encountered each other. Their definition of God is the Great Spirit. And for them, the connection with God is a very visceral one, in and through. It's the spirit that they experience in and through the land, in and through the earth. And it's from that basis that I've developed the idea then of spirit connecting with spirit as a basic working definition of spirituality. So spirit with the big S, the Great Spirit, aligned fundamentally with the spirit in each and every creature, not just in us humans. And so I think it is important to be aware there is a rich strand there in many of our First Nations peoples, which I would love to see incorporated more into contemporary spirituality and into theology.
There was a line in the book that really struck me about that, where you said, in this context, Indigenous peoples do not necessarily worship the Great Spirit.
Correct.
Rather, they forever strive to work collaboratively with the Spirit.
That's right. Yeah.
Very suggestive.
Yeah, it is. And you see, they don't have a notion of worship as we have. The other very interesting thing about the spirituality emanating therefrom, that lovely description in Paul's letter to the Romans, it's not we who pray, it's the Spirit of God who prays in us. That's exactly what the First Nations peoples believe and promote. So there are very strong links there with Christianity, it seems to me.
There, your spirit connecting with spirit is right there in Paul.
Yes, it is. It is really. Yeah.
The well, you referred to your other book in the beginning was The Spirit. Another book that really struck me was your Ancestral Grace. And you
Yes.
have, and I think in your next book, you're going to be going into paleontology too. And this idea that an apprehension of God or of the Spirit, didn't just begin a few thousand years ago, but it has to be deeply rooted in the whole evolution of human species.
Correct. Yeah, I mean, I think as far as I know, every catechism that has ever been written and promoted begins with the basic question: God created the world, God creates everything in the world, and by implication, our God is with creation at every stage of the way. Well, in that case, when we first emerged and evolved as a new species, according to the current scientific research, about 7 million years ago, then our God was fully there with us. And in the language of Paul, when God says yes, God means yes. So when are we going to begin taking that seriously? And looking then at the God who is befriending and accompanying us over those long number of years. It's going to require, among other things, that the theologians will need to revisit that notion of incarnation. I touch on this in another one of my books on theology in the evolutionary context. We'll have to redefine what we mean by incarnation. Incarnation does not just begin with Jesus of Nazareth. If you understand it as God working in and through the body, it begins in Africa 7 million years ago. And again, that long story, it's very much a story of we connecting more deeply with the earth. And when we remain very close to nature, it seems to me we tend to get it right for the greater part. It's when we set ourselves over against nature, which we began to do very significantly, for example, in the agricultural revolution about 10 to 12,000 years ago. That's when things go haywire.
What do you think are, as far as the biblical, kind of story of creation, what is helpful to us in that story, and what are some of the problems?
Well, there I'm very much with the author that you have been adopting more recently, Catherine Keller, in her book Face of the Deep of 2003. To my mind, that's one of the most seminal and fascinating books I've ever read. Basically, that whole book is about the first two verses of chapter 1 of the book of Genesis. That the Spirit is the primary activator of that creative energy. And the Spirit doesn't operate ex nihilo. The Spirit operates ex profundis, out of the deep depths, including the chaos. The Spirit draws forth creativity and order. And again, that's an affirmation of the central role of earthiness. And again, it's a wonderful affirmation too, and confirmation of our First Nations peoples, that the Spirit dwells in some very unique way in the land, in the earth, in the soil.
Well, and that connects also with other books you've written on the incarnation and
Yes.
The book you did on, well, it wasn't called Original Sin, was it? What it was called? Beyond Original Sin.
Beyond Original Sin.
Yeah, right. So you in several of your works, you emphasize, rather than this idea of the fall and the way that we're not, the implication that we're not at home, this is not our real home, we're in a kind of exile or something like that. The story of creativity that goes back into our primal origins.
Yes, correct. And it's not in any way denying that we're frail, we're sinful, we get it wrong at times. But I think the evidence emerging from paleontology, I mean, even if we could come to terms with some of the enormous creativity of the ice ice age art, which is only about 30 to 40,000 years ago. There is this long history in the best research that we now have, 2017. We can trace it back to about 3 million years ago. And so if we want to prioritize that, and you can draw on various sources on this one, even the great insight of Karl Rahner, that we're creatures who are fundamentally open to spirit, not anti-spirit or against spirit. Or that great phrase of Matthew Fox, that we're first and foremost the beneficiaries of an original blessing, not the victims of an original sin. So we're not denying the dark side or the shadow side. But it's where do we begin? Again, I was recently referring to that great speech that Nelson Mandela gave when he was first elected president. He gave it on 2 occasions within a few days. It's our light, not our darkness, that frightens us most, or that we don't know how to come to terms with.
What did that mean?
Well, that basically, this underlying creative streak in us, if you like, which is at its best when we're very close to nature and working collaboratively with nature. Then we begin to see the deeper meaning of everything in nature, rather than seeing the trees or the plants or the animals as mere usufruct for us humans, or as mere objects. And we see things in a more enlightened way, if you like.
I wonder if you could talk more about the last chapter in the book, which is called Spirituality and Christian Foundations, where you kind of bring this back to the Christian story. Why don't you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, well, again, the key point I'm making in that chapter, which I also cover in a number of my other books, is when the Gospels talk about the kingdom of God, which I try honoring the original Aramaic, usually describe as the companionship of empowerment. I think for much of Christian history, and indeed sadly among a lot of theologians even to this day, that the kingdom of God is seen as a project for human beings to help human beings to live well, admittedly in this world, but also with the hope of obtaining salvation in a world hereafter. But on a more careful reading of the kingdom of God, and people like Elizabeth Johnson and Roger Haidt and others have highlighted this, the kingdom of God includes the whole creation. It's about right relationships with all beings and not merely among human beings themselves. And that's the key point that I'm trying to make in that final chapter.
Well, you relate this to Jesus and his message, the kingdom of God, which was an anti-imperial
Correct.
attitude, you say, and you then also connect that with the eco-spirituality of a number of medieval figures like Hildegard of Bingen, St. Francis, Julian of Norwich.
That's right. There's that long historical strand. But the other thing I connected with, which I think is the first time I've done this in any of my books, I connected with the Earth Charter. That the Earth Charter, which seems quite a secular document, I'm suggesting can be taken as a kind of a blueprint, or will offer a set of very precise guidelines on what kind of shape eco-spirituality can take in our time. So you're right, there is that long historical tradition there, particularly from the Middle Ages, people like Francis, Hildegard, and a number of others. But also in our own time, I think the Earth Charter is a deeply spiritual document and can be seen and perhaps should be seen in that light.
Could you say more about what the document is, where it comes from, and what it says?
Yeah, the document first came on stream about 30 years ago, and then took a number of years to develop, and has been adopted very much by the United Nations and by all its agencies. And it's basically the need to listen more respectfully and more attentively to the dynamics at work in creation itself. And as we learn to work more collaboratively and cooperatively with nature and with creation, we ourselves will also grow and flourish better as human beings. Again, it's the message of Francis in Laudato Si. We are creatures of the earth. That would seem to be our God-given destiny. And the more we keep that close affiliation, and therefore develop strategies and policies economically, politically, and socially that will be to the benefit of all other earth creatures, will rebound back to our benefit as well as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Well, there are many other people along with yourself. We often hear this is the kind of consciousness that we have to develop, or the kind of spirituality that we have to develop. And I wonder how you feel that's going. It's 10 years or whatever since Pope Francis issued Laudato Si, and just last year he issued this new concise document, Laudate Deum, that was basically, you're not paying attention. We're not showing the kind of urgency in meeting this that we ought to.
I think there's a sort of a double movement going on. Perhaps it's more than a double. There's probably a number of prongs to it. The world leaders are certainly dragging their feet. There's no doubt about that. I think it's their economics is still very focused on profit, and obviously looking at the various elements of creation as objects with which we can make money and so forth. But I think at the ground level, there definitely is a growing swell. It's more obvious in some parts of the world, perhaps, than others. And there's where I think particularly over the past 5 years, with these severe storms, these fires that have done so much destruction, I think more and more people are waking up to the fact, yes, we are living through a time of peril, and we do need to change our behavior, and we do need to learn to live differently in our relationship with the earth. So, yeah, there's a kind of a contradictory consciousness, I suppose. People are expecting our leaders to be more enlightened and aware, and some are. I mean, I think here in a number of European countries where I live, the Green Party is certainly gaining a bit more momentum in our mainline governments, and certainly among the rank and file of society. I think there's a changing awareness, perhaps slow at times, but yeah, changing. And unfortunately, as I think is often the case in history, when we look back on it, it'll probably take more severe crises to really wake us up and to come on board. And perhaps the same would be true in hopes of our politicians.
As this must be clear in this conversation, each of your works kind of recapitulates and builds on many things you've done before. I wonder what you would say is the most original aspect of this work, and where is it pointing maybe toward where you want to go next?
I think I'll go back to that wonderful quote from Pope Francis. And therefore the key word, which I think is a key word in contemporary spirituality, integration. How do we begin to integrate so that we're not seeing ourselves as creatures with a soul superior to everything else, and therefore lording it over the rest of creation, which is still the policy and the politics that goes on in the economic world, for example. So how do we integrate a sense that everything is spiritual and is infused with the energy of spirit? How do we integrate that with our human, well, first our consciousness, then our behavior, then our way of treating and regarding the earth and the rest of creation? So where would I like to see things go? In the direction of greater integration. And that's going to require a lot of re-education. So I think there's a big responsibility here for our educational systems, which again, I think are a bit slow coming on board on this one, even though a lot of third level institutes these days have a range of new courses and possibilities for studying ecology and environmental issues and so forth. But yes, integration and working towards greater integration is what I would see as the pathway to a more sustainable and responsible future.
Well, one more thing that I'd love to hear you say a little bit more, because you've written about in several other books, and it runs through this one as well, is this idea of an adult faith. What does that mean for you?
Yes, I suppose I think that maybe is the weakness still of our educational systems, that there are the experts at the top, if you like, and they deliver the wisdom down. Now, there are various attempts around the world at changing that. I think every university and every second level school encourages greater sense of participation. And also, I think in the life of the church, we still think very much of the hierarchy, whether it's clergy, bishops, pope, and so forth, and we the people at the base are the people at the base. So the idea of the adult and bringing the adult more into the scene, it's about a greater sense of mutuality, a greater sense of mutual participation, a willingness to listen and try and hear out a range of different opinions arising from people's life experience. And as you may have gathered from some of my works, I have a particular attraction or a particular concern for wise elders.
Mm-hmm.
As of 2020, we now have more people on the planet over the age of 60 than under 16 for the first time ever. Mm. How do we our world generally is so dismissive. This is a very destructive prejudice that old people are redundant, they're useless, they're a burden on the health system and so forth. How do we mobilize a culture of the wise elders? Because I do feel that that's a wisdom that's going to be fairly critical for the future.
Well, thank you very much, Diarmuid O'Murchu, one of our wise elders and one of our prolific authors, I'm glad to say. Your new book is called Ecological Spirituality. I hope everyone will go out and read this and work your way back through his entire Orbis library, and I know there'll be more to come as well. So thank you very much, and
thank you very much, Robert. Thank
St.
you.
Patrick's Day tomorrow.
Thank you. Okay.